everyone. Welcome back to Keto and Crime. Wow. Wow. If you are watching this when it first releases on Friday, April 19th, you will be aware that I'm talking about Thursday, April 18th in the 𝗙𝗵𝗃 trial, which was just absolutely bonkers. First of all, we had continuation of the financials with FBI Special Agent Michael Douglas. Then we had the infamous Melanie Gibb. And then we had what was some great Perry Mason-ish courtroom drama with attorney Terry Radcliffe getting absolutely pummeled by Judge Boyce for filing a error-ridden last-minute attempt to delay the 𝗙𝗵𝗃 trial on the 29th. Like, he tried to delay it like 2 days before it was supposed to take place, and he misspelled a lot of things. It was poorly written, and then in front of Judge Boyce, he said he was filing it as a citizen, not an attorney, but he had used his bar ID, and Boyce absolutely just, wow. So that's what happened. We're going to talk about it. And if you're new here, my name is Tracy. I do true crime, dark history, horror movie reviews, and on cases that I have done an exceedingly huge deep dive on, like 𝗙𝗵𝗃, like Lori Vallow, like Kyle Rittenhouse. I cover those trials day by day and do my best to summarize them in as short a time as possible. Every time I say 30 minutes or less, I never make it. So I'm just going to say short a time as possible. Well, today we're going to dive into what happened on Thursday, April 18th, and let's hop into it, shall we? The morning starts off with Pryor's continuation of his cross-examination of FBI Special Agent Michael Douglas. Basically, as I had discussed the previous summary, there was a lot of financial records that had to be gone through and a timeline that kind of showed how the money followed the crimes and other happenings in these people's lives. And basically you had Pryor trying to extract Daybell's, fault in any of that, saying these were all transactions involving Lori Vallow's money, where she was stealing the Social Security benefits. So pretty much just trying to extract Daybell, saying that even though Daybell was married to Vallow at the time, I assume that they're still married, that he had nothing to do with any of these financial transactions. He wasn't even benefiting from them. Yeah, he knew how much money she made, but he wasn't benefiting from them at all. Like married couples don't share finances. That's the gist of Pryor's cross-examinations. And at one point, Douglas gets so upset, he basically says, Mr. Pryor, you just talk right over me. I'm telling you the facts of this, and you're just doing everything in your power to extract your client. I mean, he didn't say that, but he did say, you're talking over me. I'm trying to answer your question. Let me talk. It was spicy in the courtroom. But basically, the same timeline, it shows how money was moving around at the time that the murders occurred and other things. They also discussed the amount of life insurance that Tammy had left, which was $300,000. And then she had increased her policy just before her death. And they showed the applications and the things for that. And so then they talked about the purchases of the wedding rings, which 𝗙𝗵𝗃 was definitely involved with. And then Pryor finally finishes his cross-examination. Wood has a few redirect questions, basically framing in 𝗙𝗵𝗃's part in all this, talking about mistresses versus wives and how the affair partners often benefit from the finances that a dead spouse leaves when they pass. And then he basically sums it up by saying, you buy a wedding, you buy a wedding ring, your wife dies, you get married 10 days later, and then the 2 dead kids are found on your property months later. And then the fact that that some money from Lori Vallow was used to buy a burner phone that was later found to be Chad's. All of that put together, Wood summarizes, isn't that a reason to buy a burner phone? And Douglas says, absolutely. Then Pryor has a couple of little brief questions, and Douglas is finally released from his testimony. Then we move into what was the big enchilada, the state calling Melanie Gibb. This is Lori's former best friend, the lady from Arizona who did podcasts with her, was part of the religion with her, part of the cult, and basically was one of her closest confidants, and basically was one of the last people to see JJ before his disappearance. So this is the spiciness to an epic. But basically, she's called, and Lindsay Blake, Assistant DA Lindsay Blake, is questioning her. And then she asks about her past with Lori, how she met Lori, and then said that they met in church, that they actually started becoming closer in 2018. So basically, they had started a friendship, and then they went to St. George, Utah for a religious conference. And basically, there was about 5 or 6 of them from their community that went together in one vehicle, and they got close because of that. She said that is where Chad Daybell entered the picture full force. He was selling his books at the conference. Lori and Chad met there, and they started communicating. And then there was a lot of little glances. I mean, we all know about the infamous romance novel that Chad wrote about his meeting with Lori. And if you haven't, you can see my summary and breakdown of it right up there. Anyway, she said that it was obvious they were very interested in each other, but Lori was married to Charles. Then Blake asked what was discussed during the drive back to Arizona. She says Lori and Chad discussed multiple lives, past lives, the fact that Lori was married to Moroni, which is one of the biggest pieces of the Mormon religion, and that they had been married in several iterations during their past lives. So basically, Chad's almost setting himself up as Moroni. So yeah, that doesn't really surprise me. Chad is always, had a lot of delusions of grandeur. So basically, then Lindsay Blake turns the questioning about Tylee and JJ. Melanie says she first met Lori and Tylee at Lori's house, and in her opinion, Tylee and Lori had a very strained, difficult relationship, didn't get along very well, and that even though Lori was very affectionate and loving toward JJ, his autism was a problem, and it seemed to be too much for Lori at times. She said that they talked almost daily, and then after Lori started to move around a lot in January of 2019, Gibb said it was hard for her to keep up. They didn't see each other as much, but they did talk on the phone. After that first conference they went to in October, Gibb said she saw Chad again the next month at a conference in Arizona. She did not see Tammy, but he was there at a booth for his publishing company. And Gibb saw Chad again at Lori's house because he was staying with Lori and I suppose Charles while he was in Arizona. They, seemed very friendly. Definitely, she said there was some romantic attraction going on there. And then they switched to talking about how often Chad and Lori would communicate. And then they talked about their previous marriages, to each other and past lives. And then Lori told Melanie that they were going to be resealed together in the local temple. And Melanie was like, wait a minute, you still have living spouses. The Mormon church doesn't do that. She then talked about reading Chad's books and discussing them with Lori, and Lori was absolutely fanatical about Chad's books. If you need a breakdown of all of Chad's books, including his autobiography, I've done them. I'll put the playlists up there. They're also on my channel. Chad's books, for the most part, his autobiography is about his, Mormon mission, his family, his near-death experiences, his family, their near-death experiences, a lot of near-death experiences in these families. And then his fiction is all apocalyptical. It is, I call it kind of like a Mormon version of The Walking Dead almost. There's one series of books that I would say is like Walking Dead Prime, and then there's another that's Fear the Walking Dead, and then they kind of converge. One starts first, but then they kind of converge together. Standing in Holy Places and forget the name of the other series, but it's kind of like an apocalyptic series that follows the traditional Mormon view of the apocalypse, which, in all honesty, is a lot of evangelical Christian churches. They all have a similar view of the apocalypse. But anyway, they're very fictionalized. You can definitely see Chad writing himself into some of the characters and making himself come out on top. But anyway, I'll just try to stick to the trial. But anyway, they started talking about, how often Charles traveled for business, the fact that she introduced him to Alex. They started talking about, Lori would start talking about light and dark. As you know, they had created a light and dark scale. Above 0 was light, below 0 was dark, and they would rate people on how light or dark they are as their souls slowly dissipated and they were replaced by other people, i.e. Tammy being possessed by a woman named Viola, and Charles being replaced by Nick Schneider, or Schneider, however you want to pronounce that. And that if someone was light and they made a contract with Jesus Christ before they came dark, they continued to be light, but if they were dark, they had made contracts with Satan. So basically, dark bad, light good, light Jesus, dark Satan. Simple as that. And then they move on to discuss their chart and how they put people on the chart, and then that Lori felt she was a part of the 144,000, and that this is the people that are going to gather God's final community to stand in the last times. Lori often talked about people in reference to being light and dark. 𝗙𝗲𝗻𝗄, Melanie, Alex Cox were all light, and it just seems that if anybody that they didn't like was dark, from Charles to eventually both of the children were dark. So they began talking exclusively about that, and then they tried to talk about how they could possibly cast an evil spirit out of these people and try to convince them to leave. But if that didn't work, then there were predictions of their future deaths coming into it as well, which is quite convenient. And then there was some of these that never came true. For example, Chad and Lori predicted Charles would die in a traffic accident. That never happened. And then it was not long after that that Lori told Gibb that Charles had turned dark, and that's why he was going crazy about their marriage. Couldn't have been that Lori was a crazy psychopath driving him crazy, could it? But basically, just a whole lot of hate for anybody that they didn't like. Particularly a target of their anger was Brandon Boudreaux, who, remember, was married to then Melanie Boudreaux, now Melanie 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. Melanie was a fervent follower of Chad and Lori's teachings, and Brandon wasn't having it. But Brandon was a very traditional Mormon and wasn't having it. He wanted to protect his children, and as a result, he was seen as a huge obstacle. Now, these are my words, not necessarily Melanie's, but Melanie talked about how they would often call Brandon the epitome of evil, and they tried to cast him and turn him light. It didn't happen. And then Blake asked if these castings were ever done on JJ and Tylee. Gibb said she doesn't recall that. According to Melanie, if the castings would be successful, then the bodies of these possessed people would naturally pass away with no action needed to be taken. It was just very spooky. It's almost like they were having these ceremonies to basically justify why they were killing people. But they said that Lori had with Charles, and then more about her affair with Chad Daybell. And then there's a 30-minute break, and when they came back from the break, there was an interesting little happening where John Pryor attempted to have Melanie Gibb served with a subpoena to be a defense witness. So he was pretty much... She refused to take the papers, and he actually raised his voice to her in the hall, telling her she had to take them, and she refused. And then Pryor was scolded, saying that she could not be served with a subpoena at the courthouse while she's testifying for the prosecution, testify for the defense. If he wants to serve her, he needs to serve her at her home address, just like the defense did. So anyway, then she's back on the stand, and they are continuing with their with the direct exam, they started talking about how lovey-dovey Chad and Lori were, and how they had missions together and past lives and mutual affection. Lori had evidently told Melanie that every time she got together with Chad, she would ask Jesus what was acceptable and appropriate and what activities she should do with Chad. And if Jesus told her it was okay, she would meet up with Chad at hotels and do the nasty, I suppose. Basically, Jesus has given her permission to screw around on her husband, and have Chad screw around on his wife. And then Gibb said she asked Lori at one point why Chad just doesn't get a divorce, and Chad told Lori that if he got a divorce, he would lose his exaltation because his reputation is paramount. And then she asked Gibb how many phones they each had. She said she was aware of 2, but there could have been more. She wasn't really sure about it. And then they talked about how Lori thought she had been married to Moroni, and that she was related to Joseph Smith. And anyway, just a lot of description of how well Lori and Chad thought of themselves. Then they talked about that infamous weekend, September 22nd, 2019, where there was a conference in Rexburg that Gibb and Warwick attended, and then they were going to record that infamous podcast with Lori, and I have reviewed several of their podcasts right up there, the ones that still remain on the internet. And that Gibb had flown out and stayed at Lori's house. David Warwick was also there, and that now Warwick and Gibb are married, but living separately. Don't judge, I guess. She said she never saw Tylee while she was in Idaho, but she did see JJ, in the home. And then later when Alex had come in, presumably on the day JJ died, with JJ asleep or unconscious in his arms. And then she talked about the incident where she came the second day of their visit, and JJ was really upset. Chad had taken him upstairs, and then Chad came back down holding his hand. It was obvious that Chad had a red scratch on his neck from JJ. And this is where Lori started talking about basically the fact that he had climbed up on counters and threw a picture of Jesus or a statue of Jesus. And that this is where they really started getting into the demon possession. And they talk about Alex returning home with a sleeping JJ right before her and David left. And then Blake asked if Lori received any life insurance after Charles Vallow's death. She said no. As far as she knew, all that had been written over to the Woodcocks for the benefit of JJ. Gibb said Lori told her she was going to meet JJ once she was concerned about JJ being missing. She had told Lori that Lori had told Melanie that she was going to give JJ to his grandparents, the Woodcocks, and that she was meeting them at the airport to make that exchange. And Gibb said she thought JJ was with the Woodcocks for a little while. Then in November 2019, 3 days before Thanksgiving, Chad called Gibb when she was in Utah and told her that the Rexburg police were going to call about JJ, and asked her not to pick up the phone. He said Lori had told the police that Gibb had JJ, and that Chad sounded very, very nervous. Gibb asked Chad, isn't JJ with the Woodcocks? And Chad said no. He told her Lori would be calling her, but she was talking to the police. Lori later called Gibb and was very positive and upbeat. She said that she was protecting JJ and Kylie from Kay because they were trying to kidnap them for financial reasons. Why would they need to? They already had the life insurance, Lori. Gibb said that Lori told her to go to a Frozen movie and take pictures of other kids to make it look like Gibb had him, and she absolutely refused. Gibb says that Alex had told her law enforcement were considered dark translated beings. That's very, very convenient. Anyway, so instead of lying for Lori, she called the Gilbert police. She said she had had JJ a couple of points, but had no longer had him, and that he was back with Lori as far as she knew. So she basically told them the truth. And then the infamous December phone call where Gibb called Chad and Lori and basically dressed them down. Now, they do play this call. I'm not going to play it here, but it's all over the internet. It's linked to East Idaho News' coverage of the day's trial. But basically, the gist of the call was Melanie basically told Chad and Lori what they were doing was wrong. They basically called her an apostate in so many words because she was breaking away from their teachings, and yelled about how David Warwick, was a bad influencer on her, and she defended her, then future husband. And then they basically told her he is safe and happy, but would not tell them where he is. And we all know that in Lori's definition, the children were in pain, struggling, possessed, and death was a safe situation for them, though she never told Melanie Gibb that in so many words. And then they talk more about the Mormon religion and their particular religious beliefs, all of that good culty stuff. The gist of it is that Chad and Lori were using their similarities to people in the Book of Mormon and in the Bible, and the fact they had been married in past lives gave them the right to be together in this life, even though, they at one point had both been married and then Chad was still married, that this was their justification for what they were doing that was obviously wrong. And then their belief that multiple marriages are okay. Not even the mainstream Mormon church still has those beliefs. And then after lunch, we continue with Melanie Gibb's direct testimony. She's talking about how Chad had made a recording making comments that Tammy was going to die shortly before October 2019, that she had seen the veil beginning to thin and was seeing herself on the other side, was seeing herself with other Mormon martyrs, and that she felt that she was going to die. And then Chad started to play up her supposed illnesses, which were never proven. You got to remember, they subpoenaed her medical records. Yes, she was on an anti-anxiety, antidepressant for a little while. And then, yes, she had some minor problems with, I believe, a hurt arm, but there was nothing that would have killed her so suddenly. Also, she was an avid walker runner. She competed in 5Ks, 10Ks, and she was also training for one, so they had her Fitbit data showing how active she truly was. Not something that would be considered a sick person. And then they talked about, did Alex Cox really believe all this stuff about the zombies, which was primarily how, according to Melanie, how they were manipulating Alex to be the revenging angel. And she said, as far as she knew, Alex 100% believed all of that. And then basically, Lindsay Blake has no further questions, and Pryor begins to cross-examine. Basically, his cross-examination talks about more about the ideology that they all believed, and also how he's basically trying to paint Lori as the more fanatical one. I mean, we kind of knew that was going to be. And then he basically dressed her down about David Warwick and asking how long they had been married. And she said they'd been married 3.5 years, but then they realized within 10 months that they needed to live in different households. And so they've been living apart, Gibb back in Arizona and Warwick in Utah. And then they started asking about all the dreams and visions, particularly the one that David Warwick supposedly had the night before JJ disappeared, and she said it was quite terrifying for him. And basically, Pryor is trying to demonize Gibb and Warwick. Now, let me get this straight. I don't think David Warwick and Melanie Gibb are good people. I think they're just as delusional as Chad and Lori. If it hadn't have been for the disappearance and deaths of the children and Tammy, and they had all stayed together in their little cult, I believe there was a power struggle between Dave and Chad going on, and that's the reason there was that fallout. And I believe if the children and Tammy had been killed, or if they had gotten away with that, I believe one or more of these core four would have would have ended up being murdered by the other. I think that's how deep they were. I don't believe any of them are good people, and I think Melanie Gibb should be facing some charges for not coming forward a lot sooner than she did. Then he asked her about her book, 𝗘𝗿𝗄𝐿. I have reviewed that book. It is a pile of hot garbage, and it also shows how narcissistic Melanie is. That link is up there. And then they talked about all the many text messages and conversations, how close her and Lori was, and basically trying to concentrate on Lori as we kind of knew he would. Then Pryor asked her about her relationship with the children. She said that, JJ was just kind of there, that she, cared about JJ, but she was a lot closer to JJ than she was 𝗙𝗏, and it's a well-known fact that Gibb and 𝗙𝗏 hated each other. So, yeah, 𝗙𝗏 is one of the smartest people out of this whole thing, and I think that's why she was probably killed in a much more violent manner. I would suspect there may have been some assault there, and why her body was chopped up and partially burned. Chad had a huge distaste for 𝗙𝗏 because 𝗙𝗏 called them on their bullshit, and she even told her mother many times, "Mom, I'm not dark. No, Mom, not me." That is in recorded lines calls between Melanie Gibb and Lori Vallow. So 𝗙𝗏 was a little spitfire. And then basically they go into discussions about Charles and Lori's potential divorce, about how Lori was upset about the life insurance money, and then basically going more and more in depth about Lori and Chad's relationship, Lori's background, her background with men, and how she just has a really dark view. And then they play a recording where basically Lori says that she will do whatever God needs her to do. And she said, "I will do." And he wanted to really hone in that she said, "I will do whatever God needs to do, not we will do." Again, implicating that Lori is the mastermind behind everything, including Tammy's death. So she said she wasn't 100% sure what, every time they saw Chad and Lori saw each other, what they actually did, what they actually talked about. Then they talked about how Chad was looking into buying some property, and since David Warwick had been in the real estate field, and the last time that anyone saw JJ alive during that whole conference podcast weekend, they were going to go out and look at some land, and then they came home, and that's when they recorded the podcast. And then the next day is when Alex came in carrying an unconscious or sleeping JJ, and then that night is when Warwick had his nightmare, and they attempted to get into Lori's bedroom to check on Lori and JJ because the dream was so vivid, but wasn't able to. And then, of course, they left the next day, and then more about zombies, and then the testimony ends, and then we get into the situation with attorney Ratliff trying to delay the trial for some ungodly reason, and Boyce just basically dresses him down, and he left without his balls. So, and then court is dismissed for the day. They will be back in court on today. If you're watching this when it's first released, Friday, April 19th. I will be back with you either Saturday or Sunday to go over what happened on Friday, April 19th. Thank you so much, and until next time, keep doing crime.